This story is a fictional work created for entertainment purposes. It does not depict real people, real events, or any official military actions. I was already standing in the witness box when they walked into the federal courtroom in Fort Bragg. The air inside that room carried a rigid quiet, the kind that settles only when uniforms are present. My Class A jacket felt heavier than usual across my shoulders, but my face remained steady, trained into a calm expression through years of discipline. I watched Linda and Mark Dawson enter with the same confidence of people who believed the world still owed them something. They smiled at the clerk, whispered to their attorney, adjusted their neat outfits as if they were preparing for a family reunion instead of a legal confrontation. They did not recognize me. 30 years will do that. The judge had not yet entered, so the gallery murmured with scattered voices. I heard someone whisper about my rank and someone else comment on the presence of a military officer inside a civil inheritance case. None of that mattered. My eyes remained on the two people who had once driven me to a military base gate, told me to stand still, and disappeared into the night without looking back. Now they were here to demand $6 million from the will of the man who had saved me. If you believe parents who do something like this deserve consequences, comment justice or mercy right now. This case had drawn public attention because of the circumstances around General Raymond Carver, a four-star commander who had once overseen parts of Southern Command and who had lived his final years quietly in Fayetteville. His passing made national headlines for a single day, but the detail no one expected was his decision to leave his entire estate to me. The Dawsons filed their lawsuit 2 weeks later. Their attorney argued that I had been taken illegally, that the adoption had hidden irregularities, that the general had manipulated a minor and cut the biological parents out of her life. They brushed past the fact that they had not attempted to contact me at any point for 3 decades. The bailiff finally stepped forward and called everyone to rise. The judge entered, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room with sharp accuracy. When she noticed my uniform, she nodded politely before turning toward the plaintiffs. The Dawsons straightened ready for the performance they had rehearsed. What they did not know was that the judge recognized my name and my rank and that she knew where I served. She also knew what I had been through long before this trial ever began. My moment came when the court requested my opening statement. I stepped forward, boots silent on the polished floor, my posture as straight as the day I graduated from West Point. My voice did not shake. It carried the tone of someone who had survived the worst day of her life at age 6 and refused to be broken again. I began with the truth that mattered most. When I was a child, the Dawsons abandoned me outside the main gate of Fort Hood. They told me they would return. They never did. My words pushed a visible crack through their confidence. The gallery shifted, people leaning in. I let the silence settle before continuing. A military police patrol found me that night. A general I had never met chose to protect me. He gave me a home. He gave me a future. And now, decades later, my biological parents have appeared not to make amends, but to take from the man who stepped in when they threw me away. I looked directly at them as the final line left my mouth. 30 years ago, you left me outside a military gate like trash. Today, I will return the favor legally. August of 1996 settled over Fort Hood with the kind of heat that clung to everything. Even after sunset, the air still shimmered and the headlights of cars approaching the main gate carved long streaks across the pavement. I was 6 years old and my sandals slapped against the ground as I tried to keep up with the hurried steps of Linda and Mark Dawson. They had argued in the car before we arrived, voices breaking into sharp pieces that I did not understand. When the engine shut off, they opened the doors without looking at me. The sky was turning a deep dark blue when they pulled me toward the security fence that stretched along the perimeter of the gate. I remember Mark checking his watch. He kept tapping the glass as if the time itself were at fault. Linda's hand tightened on my arm. Her tone rose with impatience. "Stay here, we will be right back." The words struck faster than the sound of their footsteps leaving. I stood still because that was what I had been told to do. Then the car door slammed and I watched the taillights trail away. I waited for them to circle back. I waited for their silhouettes to reappear beneath the bright lamps of the guard post. Minutes stretched until they no longer felt like minutes. The night pressed against my skin. The red and blue lights from the security checkpoint pulsed across my face. A gust of warm wind carried the smell of dust and fuel. My knees wobbled as I sank beside the chain-link fence. Cars continued to move in and out of the gate while soldiers checked identification cards. Their voices carried in bursts. Nothing sounded certain or comforting. I hugged my arms tight against my chest. My throat felt too small for words. My cheeks were hot with fear, though I did not allow myself to cry. Someone had told me that crying annoyed adults. I did not want to risk being trouble now. The heat and noise wrapped around me until everything blurred. I kept whispering that they would return, that this was a mistake, that any moment I would hear them. Then a pair of heavy boots stopped near me. I lifted my head and saw a tall man in a military police uniform. His badge read Keller. His flashlight lowered to my face and his voice softened instantly. "Hey, kid, what are you doing out here alone?" My answer came out as a broken breath. "My parents told me to wait." He looked toward the road behind me, though nothing moved except a few cars heading toward the city lights. He crouched down so our eyes met. "You look cold. Come on, let us get you inside." The guard shack behind the gate glowed with fluorescent lights. As he guided me toward it, his radio crackled. Another MP turned his head. The sight of a child being led into the shack created an immediate ripple across the soldiers working their shifts. One of them muttered low enough to think I could not hear, but the words still traveled straight into my memory. "Who leaves a kid at a military gate?" That reaction spread quickly as heads turned and voices dropped into concerned murmurs. I became the center of questions from soldiers who had seen everything except this. The world of Fort Hood ran on structure, protocol, and order. Children were never supposed to appear out of the darkness without guardians. Public exposure moment number 1 had begun. Sergeant Keller sat me on a metal chair inside the shack while he called for a supervisor. My legs dangled as I stared at the floor. The cool air inside the room made me shiver despite the heat outside. Someone handed me a bottle of water. Another placed a small blanket over my shoulders. Every gesture felt like it came from strangers who cared more than the people who had driven me there. The supervisor arrived within minutes. He asked for my name. I could barely force it out. Elise Dawson. He exchanged a look with Keller that I did not understand. They tried calling the number I recited with shaky breath. The phone rang unanswered again and again. The soldiers around me grew more uneasy. They whispered, but not quietly enough. A kid abandoned at a gate was not something they could ignore. If you have ever seen something this unfair, comment "yes" if you think this is cruel. The door opened once more, and the room shifted as if everyone felt the arrival before seeing it. A tall man with gray hair stepped inside, wearing fatigues marked with 4 stars. His presence carried calm authority. General Raymond Carver had been passing through the checkpoint after returning from a late briefing. When he noticed the unusual activity, he asked what happened. Keller explained the situation carefully. The general looked down at me with steady eyes, and I met them despite wanting to disappear. His gaze held no confusion, no annoyance, no judgment, only understanding. He knelt so he was close to my height. "You are safe now. We will figure this out." Something in his tone reached deeper than any blanket or bottle of water. For the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of air fill my lungs. I did not know then that this man would become the center of my world, or that this moment would divide my life into a before and an after. All I knew was that he stayed when 2 others had chosen to walk away. The guard shack felt smaller once General Carver stepped inside. Even at 6 years old, I sensed the shift in the air. Soldiers straightened, voices lowered. Authority carried its own gravity, and he wore it without effort. He studied me with a quiet patience that made me feel seen rather than examined. When he spoke, his tone was measured and calm. "Elise, is that right?" My head dipped in a tiny nod. "Do you know where your parents went?" The question pressed something sharp in my chest. They said they would be right back. That was all I managed. He held my gaze another moment, then motioned to Keller to continue the report. While they spoke, I watched the general from the corner of my vision. His uniform bore 4 stars on each shoulder, a symbol even a child could recognize as important. Later, I would learn he commanded 3 corps and had earned his rank through decades of service, including operations during the Gulf War. In that moment, he did not feel like a high-ranking officer. He felt like the first adult who talked to me instead of around me. A medic from the nearby clinic arrived to perform a health check. They lifted me gently onto a bench and checked my arms, legs, and back. The medic's voice turned serious as he documented bruises and signs of chronic neglect. He asked how long I had felt hungry. I shrugged because hunger had become something too ordinary to measure. The general watched silently, his expression tightening, while the medic worked. When the report was handed to him, he exhaled slowly, as if steadying something inside himself. "Thank you, Sergeant. Please notify Child Protective Services immediately." The call went out, and for a while the room filled with low radio chatter. I sat wrapped in the thin blanket while soldiers moved around me. The only constant was the general, who remained close enough for me to know I was not alone. An officer brought him a folder with preliminary information gathered from my name. According to records, Linda and Mark Dawson had no active emergency contacts. They had no pending reports of a missing child. They had not called the base. They had not called local police. They had not filed anything. When CPS arrived, the caseworker listened as Keller explained where he found me and how long I had been waiting. She asked if anyone had come back or called. No one had. The caseworker turned toward me with a gentle but cautious smile. "Elise, we will try to reach your parents again. Until we do, we need to place you somewhere safe." The sentence "safe" caught my attention. It felt like a word from another language. Before they led me to the vehicle, the general stepped forward. "I would like to request temporary guardianship until the investigation is complete." The caseworker blinked in surprise. "Sir, that process usually requires civilian review." "I understand, but this child was abandoned outside a military installation. Until we confirm otherwise, she is under our jurisdiction." The room stilled. Even at that age, I sensed the weight behind his words. He was not exerting rank. He was offering protection. The caseworker studied him, then looked down at me. I reached for the general's sleeve without thinking. Something inside me had already chosen. The caseworker saw that small movement, and her hesitation faded. "Very well, General. Temporary placement approved pending review." That was how I ended up in the back seat of a government sedan riding toward the officer housing area with a man I had met less than an hour earlier. The night outside had grown quieter. I focused on the steady hum of the engine until the general spoke. "Elise, I know you are scared, and I know none of this is your fault." His voice carried a certainty that made something loosen inside my ribs. "Do you know why your parents left you there?" I shook my head. I had asked myself that question until it lost meaning. Sometimes adults fail in ways they cannot admit. He paused before adding, "But that failure is theirs, not yours." When we arrived at his home, the porch light glowed across neatly trimmed grass and a carefully maintained walkway. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Photographs decorated the walls. Most were of him standing beside soldiers or handshaking dignitaries. One photograph caught my eye. A woman with kind eyes stood beside him, smiling as if she held the sun in her hands. He noticed my gaze. "My wife, Margaret. She passed a few years ago." His tone softened. "We never had children." I looked at the picture again, sensing a missing piece in the house. Something gentle and warm had once filled the space where I now stood trembling. He led me to the guest room that seemed far too nice for someone like me. Clean sheets folded perfectly, a lamp glowing softly, a teddy bear placed neatly on the pillow as if waiting. I sat on the edge of the bed, not knowing whether to speak or stay silent. The general crouched again to meet my eyes. "Until the state decides what comes next, you will stay here. You will be safe, Elise. I promise you that." Promises were things adults broke easily. Yet for the first time, I believed one. Days passed. CPS interviewed neighbors and attempted to locate the Dawsons, but found nothing. According to employment records, they had left their jobs months earlier. Their house lease had expired. They had no forwarding address. They had not filed a missing child report. The caseworker returned with an uneasy expression. "General Carver, I believe the abandonment was intentional." The rest of her sentence faded into a blur as I stared at the patterned carpet. Intentional. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A choice. That realization cracked something inside me. but the general rested a hand on my shoulder, steadying my breath. In the weeks that followed, he completed every requirement for temporary guardianship. Then came the home study. After that, background checks. Then formal hearings. Through each step, he stood with a composed confidence that made state officials trust him easily. The adoption was finalized the following spring. I left the courtroom holding the hand of the man who had chosen me when others had chosen to leave. Years later, I would understand that his decision had not been made out of pity. It had come from a sense of duty shaped by decades of service and from a quiet heart that still carried the memory of a wife who had wanted a family. In that moment, though, I simply knew I was no longer alone. Life in General Carver's household did not revolve around noise. It revolved around rhythm, discipline, and a kind of quiet order that seeped into everything. Mornings began before sunrise when the Texas heat had not yet settled across Fort Hood. The general woke at the same time every day, moving through his routine with deliberate precision. By the time I reached elementary school, I had already memorized the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor and the way he cleared his throat before speaking. That predictability gave me a sense of safety I had never known. Growing up in a military environment meant learning structure early, not through shouting or punishment, but through example. He taught me to fold my clothes so that every line aligned. He taught me to keep my shoes near the door so I would never search for them while running late. He taught me that if something was broken, I should fix it before someone else had to. The house was never silent exactly. It hummed with purpose. Still, the memories of being abandoned crept in at unexpected moments. I could be brushing my teeth or tying my shoes, and suddenly a memory of the gate lights would flash through my mind. Whenever I heard a car door slam too sharply, I felt my chest tighten. Whenever someone said they would be right back, I watched the clock to make sure they meant it. The general noticed these small shifts, though I rarely spoke about them. He seemed to understand that fear clung to children longer than adults realized. One evening, after I refused to go to sleep because I was afraid he would leave, while I dreamed, he sat beside me on the edge of the bed. His voice carried that steady calm that anchored everything. Elise, fear is not a flaw, it is a memory. But memories are not commands. You get to choose what you do next. Then he added a line he would repeat throughout my childhood. Honor is what you do when no one watches. At 6, the words sounded too big for me. At 10, I began to understand. By 12, the meaning rooted itself so deeply that it shaped every part of who I was becoming. School at Killeen Middle introduced a different world from the structured calm of home. The hallways echoed with locker doors slamming and sneakers squeaking across floors polished daily. Teachers recognized my last name long before they learned my first. Being the adopted daughter of a 4-star general invited a strange mix of distance and pressure. Some kids treated me cautiously as if I were made of fragile material. Others assumed I had privileges I had never used. They whispered that officers' families were spoiled even though I still packed my own lunches and scrubbed my own shoes. My real struggle, though, was something none of them could see. It was the shadow of abandonment that followed me down every hallway. When a teacher forgot to call on me, I wondered if I had done something wrong. When a friend canceled plans, I felt the same sinking fear that had struck me at the base gate. I carried the question of what I had done to be left behind, even though the general reminded me again and again that the fault had never been mine. "You are not what was done to you," he told me once while helping me repair a loose strap on my backpack. "You are what you do next." Even with his reassurance, I feared humiliation more than anything. The memory of that first public exposure when soldiers murmured about the abandoned kid at the gate returned constantly. But something shifted as I grew older. Instead of shrinking from the memory, I began to use it. If anyone questioned my resilience, I remembered that night and reminded myself that I had survived something many adults could not imagine. If anyone tried to belittle me, I held on to the truth that I had already been broken once and rebuilt stronger. The general's teachings built on that strength. He taught me how to run without tripping over my own breath. He taught me how to hold my head level even when I felt small. He taught me leadership was not a title but a choice made daily. When you act with integrity, he said, people will follow even if they disagree. The general also balanced discipline with care. He encouraged me to join club sports and student groups. When I froze during a public speaking assignment, he attended the next presentation and stood quietly in the back. I stumbled through the speech, but knowing he was there steadied me. For the first time, I felt the steady foundation of someone who would not leave. Of course, not everything was smooth. Middle school was filled with whispers, drama, and shifting friendships. Kids could be careless with their words. One boy once joked that my real parents had probably gotten tired of me. The hallway erupted in laughter, and my cheeks burned so hot I felt dizzy. Instead of crying, I stared him down with a stillness I learned from the general. That night, I told Carver what happened. He listened, then said something that stayed with me for years. People fear what they do not understand. Your strength intimidates them. Use that strength wisely, not as a weapon, but as a compass. If you have ever had to stand up alone in your life, leave a like. So I know you are here. By the time I graduated middle school, I no longer trembled when someone raised their voice. The memory of the gate no longer froze me. Instead, it sharpened my determination. I joined junior ROTC in high school partly because it intrigued me, and partly because it felt like the natural extension of everything the general had taught me. The drills, discipline, and teamwork came easily. Marching in formation felt strangely familiar, like stepping into a rhythm my life had been preparing me for. Though I did not yet know it, every step I took was leading me toward the moment I would tell the general I wanted to follow his path. At the time, I only knew that the fear of being left behind had transformed into a resolve never to let anyone control my story again. By the time I turned 18, the question of what came next did not feel like a question at all. It felt like a road that had always been beneath my feet, even before I understood where it led. In the spring of 28, I sat across from General Carver at the kitchen table while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. I kept tracing the edge of my application packet, unable to speak. Finally, he set down his coffee cup and waited in the patient way he always used when he knew I had something important to say. "I want to apply to West Point." The words spilled out tremulous but sure. His eyes lifted, and for a moment the stern lines of his face softened into something almost proud. "Are you doing this because of me, or because of you?" "Because of me," I whispered. "Because this is where I want to prove that everything you taught me matters." The general nodded slowly, as though weighing something ancient and heavy. "If you choose this path, it will not be easy. You will be tested harder than you can imagine. I know, and you cannot rely on anyone, not even me. I know that too." He leaned back, then tapped the table twice. "Then you have my full support, Elise." The acceptance letter arrived 2 months later. The day we drove to West Point was humid and bright. Cadet candidates lined up across the courtyard, waiting to begin reception day. Their families hovered nearby, offering encouragement, water bottles, and last-minute reminders. The general stood beside me, silent but present. When the officer called new cadets forward, he squeezed my shoulder once. Earn everything he said. Then he stepped back and let me walk alone. Reception day at West Point felt like stepping into a storm of commands motion and transformation. Upper-class cadets barked instructions while we scrambled to memorize responses. I learned how to stand, how to sit, how to march, and how to answer questions without flinching. The uniform I received felt stiff but sacred. The sun glinted off windows and metal, and the collective heat of hundreds of cadets swelled until it felt like the air itself pressed down. Training at the academy was not simply difficult, it was relentless. Physical tests pushed every limit I thought I had. I learned the ache of muscles after pre-dawn runs and the sting of blisters from hours in formation. During one ruck march, my ankle twisted on uneven gravel and a sharp pain shot upward. I kept moving until I collapsed near the finish. A medic told me it was a sprain. For a week, I hobbled through drills, refusing to quit. Pain was temporary. Quitting was not an option, yet the physical strain was not the only battle. The academy held old traditions, and some cadets still clung to narrow ideas of who belonged. Several male classmates made comments about how women had it easier or how they would not last in combat arms. One day during lunch, a second-year cadet said loudly that women joined only for attention. Another added that West Point admitted too many females to fill quotas. Their laughter echoed through the dining hall. I stared at my tray, but inside, something cold and determined solidified. They could doubt me, they could mock me, but they would not outwork me. Quiet resilience became my strategy. I woke earlier, trained, harder, studied longer than anyone around me. If they were running 5 miles, I ran 6. If they stayed in the library until 10, I stayed until midnight. My grades climbed, my push-up count doubled, my ruck times dropped. I learned how to carry myself with a steadiness that no insult could crack. Of course, the whispers did not stop completely. Early in my first semester, a rumor circulated that I was the adopted daughter of a 4-star general. A few cadets treated me suspiciously, assuming I had received favoritism. Some avoided me altogether, as if association might violate their idea of merit. One evening in the barracks, a classmate confronted me directly. "Must be nice to have a general in your pocket." His tone dripped with sarcastic admiration. I met his stare without hesitation. "My father cannot carry my pack for me. He cannot run my miles. He cannot take my exams. Everything I earn here, I earn myself." He blinked, taken aback by the firmness in my voice. After that, no one made such comments to my face, though I still heard my name float in the air, sometimes followed by exaggerated curiosity. It only sharpened my focus. During field training exercises, I learned how to navigate through dense forest with nothing but a compass. I learned how to set up defensive positions and how to communicate under stress. I learned how to push past exhaustion until every breath became a choice. Leadership evaluations taught me how to give orders clearly and how to accept responsibility when something went wrong. I discovered that leading was not about being obeyed, but about being trusted. The hardest challenge arrived midway through my second year when we completed a week-long field event in pouring rain. The temperature dropped unexpectedly, and several cadets became hypothermic. I felt my fingers go numb while digging a foxhole in thick mud. My poncho barely held the rain off. My muscles trembled from cold and fatigue. A squad mate suggested I fall back because my lips had turned pale. If I step back, I told him, then someone else carries my weight. That is not happening. By dawn, the rain eased. When the cadre evaluated us, I received one of the highest marks in the squad. That moment carved something permanent inside me. I was not the abandoned child at the gate anymore. I was a cadet who endured. The general kept his promise not to interfere. He never called faculty. He never visited unannounced. When he did write letters, they were brief and pointed. Earn it. Lead with integrity. Do not forget who you are. During my final year, he attended a leadership award ceremony. When my name was called and I stepped forward, he stood in the back of the auditorium. He did not applaud louder than anyone else, but his expression carried unmistakable pride. After the ceremony, we walked along the stone path outside the hall. He asked if I had any regrets. None, sir. Good, because your next chapter begins the moment you take that commission. You will have to prove yourself all over again. The weight of his words settled on my shoulders not as a burden, but as a mantle. West Point had shaped me, but the Army would test everything I had become. Commissioning day in 2012 felt like standing at the edge of a new world. The Hudson River shimmered behind the parade field while rows of cadets waited to receive their gold bars. My uniform felt crisp, my boots polished to a shine that reflected the sky. When my name was called, I marched forward with steady steps. The moment my rank insignia was pinned, I felt the weight of responsibility settle across my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a promise. I had earned this. The general attended the ceremony quietly and with the same unspoken pride he carried through every milestone of my life. When the crowd dispersed, he walked beside me toward the edge of the field. Now begins the real test, he said. You will serve where you are needed, not where you are comfortable. I nodded because that was exactly what I wanted. My orders placed me in Army intelligence. The work demanded precision, adaptability, and the ability to process information under pressure. After completing initial training, I joined a unit preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. The moment I arrived, I realized the academy had prepared me academically and physically, but nothing could fully prepare someone for the weight of real operations. In Afghanistan, the air carried fine dust that settled into every crease of clothing. Helicopters thumped overhead at all hours. The base was a mosaic of tense vehicles and hurried footsteps. My role required analyzing patterns in local activity, monitoring communication lines, and identifying threats before they materialized. The stakes were clear. Mistakes had consequences that could not be undone. I learned quickly that intelligence work demanded calm even when information arrived in fragments. During my first month, our unit tracked reports of shifting movements near a supply route. Patterns looked inconsistent, but I noticed a detail others missed. A series of seemingly unrelated communications pointed toward a coordinated attempt to disrupt a convoy. I presented my analysis hesitantly at first, unsure if my voice carried enough weight. The operations officer reviewed it. Within hours, leadership altered the route. The next morning, explosive ordnance teams discovered a concealed device along the original path. The officers who had doubted my assessment approached me one by one, offering quiet acknowledgments. It was not praise that mattered, it was the trust. Deployment shaped me in ways training never could. Nights often brought the echo of distant noise and the tension of anticipating what might come next. Days demanded endurance not of the body but of the mind. I learned to read subtle cues in behavior and landscape. I learned to compartmentalize my emotions. I learned that leadership meant steadying others even when your own hands trembled. My evaluations reflected the growth. Commanders described my work as exceptional and deliberate. They said I possessed a clarity under pressure that belied my years. But for me, every commendation felt like an affirmation of a promise made long ago at a base gate in Texas. Honor is what you do when no one watches. I carried those words through every shift, every briefing, and every decision. Between missions, I wrote letters to the general. They were short, sometimes no more than a paragraph. I told him about the dust storms, the long nights, the satisfaction of solving puzzles that protected lives. He responded with steady encouragement, reminding me to stay grounded, to trust my judgment, and to lead with integrity. His letters became a tether to home. When deployment ended, I returned stateside, different from the young officer who had first boarded the plane. I felt older, stronger, and more aware of the fragility of every day. The general met me at the airport. For a moment, I saw his eyes study me as if taking inventory of every change. "You made it home," he said softly before stepping back to give a small nod of respect. In the years that followed, I rose in rank, completing additional courses and assignments. The path was challenging, but purposeful. I worked on strategic analysis projects, traveled between bases, and contributed to planning that shaped operations far beyond my immediate reach. Then, in early 2018, everything shifted. I received the call while reviewing reports late at night. The voice on the other end spoke carefully. The general had suffered a sudden stroke. He had been transported to the hospital, but his condition deteriorated quickly. By the time I arrived, the hallway was quiet, and the fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across the floor. A doctor met me near the door with a solemn expression. I stepped inside the room, expecting to hear his voice steady and sure. Instead, I found silence. The sight of him lying still delivered a blow deeper than anything I had endured in uniform. He had been the anchor of my life, the foundation beneath every success. Losing him felt like standing once again outside a base gate with nothing but darkness around me. A few days later, I stood at his funeral in full uniform among rows of soldiers past and present. His casket was draped with the flag he had served for decades. Speeches honored his leadership, his service, his sacrifices, but none of them captured the quiet, unwavering care he had given me. When taps played, the sound hollowed out the air around me. It felt like the final note of a chapter I was not ready to close. As preparations settled, a lawyer contacted me regarding the general's will. I expected nothing beyond personal belongings. Instead, he handed me a sealed envelope and a detailed document. The general had left instructions precise and thoughtful. He had arranged for me to inherit his estate, including savings properties and investment accounts totaling $6 million. The number did not register at first. What struck me was the message inside his handwritten letter. "Elise, you were never an obligation. You were a choice. My choice. Use this not as a gift, but as a tool to build the life you deserve." I folded the letter carefully as though the ink might fade if handled too roughly. The estate was not a reward. It was a final act of faith from the man who had reshaped my entire existence. I could not have known that news of the inheritance would travel farther than expected, or that two people who had disappeared from my life decades earlier would re-emerge with a claim that would ignite a legal battle neither of us had foreseen. News of General Carver's funeral reached more households than I expected. His career had spanned decades, and his influence touched nearly every corner of the Army. Local stations in Texas and North Carolina ran short segments honoring his service. National channels mentioned him briefly during morning broadcasts. I did not imagine for a moment that any of those broadcasts would serve as a beacon to the two people who had abandoned me outside Fort Hood. But the world has a way of circling back in painful patterns. According to later court records, the first spark happened in a cramped living room in Waco, where Linda and Mark Dawson sat watching a news segment about distinguished military leaders who had recently passed. A photograph of the general filled the screen, then shifted to a clip of attendees at the funeral. In that clip, for less than 2 seconds, my face appeared as I saluted beside the honor guard. Something in my expression or posture must have struck them because Linda reportedly leaned forward until her hand covered her mouth. Mark squinted at the screen, then muttered a name that had not left his lips for decades. Elise. They watched the clip again online, frame by frame. Then they searched the obituary. When they found the mention of his surviving family, they saw my full name. Major Elise Carver. Age 34. They did not apologize. They did not feel guilt or grief or disbelief. Their first reaction was shock that shifted quickly into something sour and familiar, a mixture of jealousy, resentment, and greed. They had left a child behind. They had assumed she faded into the system. They had never suspected she would grow into an officer whose name appeared on national broadcasts. The next realization arrived when they found the article stating that the general had left an estate. $6 million. From that moment forward, the trajectory of their lives bent sharply toward mine. They visited a local attorney known for taking on inheritance disputes. Unlike military justice, where facts and integrity guide outcomes, civil disputes often attract people willing to believe whatever story benefits them. The Dawsons claimed the adoption had been unlawful. They told the attorney they had searched tirelessly for me after that night but had been misled by base officials. They said they had grieved the loss of a daughter they never wanted to lose. They said they only discovered my fate when the news revealed I was connected to a 4-star general. Every lie slid out of their mouths smoothly because lies had always been easier for them than truth. The attorney requested documentation. They produced nothing. When he asked why they had not contacted authorities in 1996, they improvised a narrative about fear, misunderstandings, and bureaucratic confusion. He did not know the details of my life. He did not see the base gate. He did not hear the silence that marked their absence. He agreed to represent them. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, they filed a civil complaint alleging unlawful adoption, inheritance theft, emotional damages, and violation of parental rights. I was still sorting through the general's personal belongings when the doorbell rang one humid afternoon. A uniformed process server stood on the porch holding a thick envelope. His expression was neutral, but he hesitated slightly before handing it to me. Elise Carver, these are for you. I accepted the envelope without speaking. The weight of it pressed against my palm as though it carried the shift of an old fault line cracking open. After I signed the receipt, he stepped back. Condolences for your loss, ma'am. Then he left. I closed the door slowly and leaned against it, letting the quiet fill the room. Sunlight cut across the floor in sharp lines. The house felt too still without the general's steady footsteps. I slid my thumb under the envelope seal and opened it. Inside were pages filled with accusations written in the sterile language of legal disputes. Words like misconduct, negligence, unlawful guardianship, and exploitation flashed across the page. The claim stated that the adoption had been performed without proper consent. It argued that the Dawsons had been denied their parental rights. It declared that I had wrongfully benefited from the general's estate and owed restitution to the people who had abandoned me before my 7th birthday. For a long moment, I did not move. The anger did not arrive quickly. It arrived slowly, like cold air creeping under a door. At first, it felt impossible, then absurd, then sharp enough to cut. They had not called on my 18th birthday. They had not written when I deployed. They had not appeared at any point in my life. They had never once reached out to say they regretted their decision. And now the first contact in nearly 3 decades was a lawsuit demanding the fortune of the man who saved me. I set the papers on the table and stepped back. My breath felt too tight for my chest. In the hallway, the photograph of the general in his Gulf War uniform hung above the small bookshelf where he kept his medals. I stood before the frame and studied the hard lines of his face. He had known loss. He had known betrayal. But he had never once let bitterness shape his choices. That reminder steadied me. I picked up the envelope again and flipped to the final page, which listed the court date. It was scheduled sooner than expected. I suspected the Dawsons had pushed for urgency, so they could catch me still unsteady from grief. Grief, however, has a strange way of sharpening resolve. I called the legal office on base for guidance. The officer who answered directed me to the appropriate channels for civilian court representation. When I hung up, I felt the first spark of something fierce and clear. They thought I was the abandoned child from that night in 1996. They expected someone timid, someone overwhelmed, someone who would fold under pressure. They did not know this cadet who endured West Point. They did not know the officer who served in Afghanistan. They did not know the woman the general raised with relentless discipline and unwavering belief. I looked at the papers again. Each page felt like a challenge issued from a past I had buried. But I was not that child anymore. And this time, I would not wait for someone to return. I would meet them head on. The night after receiving the lawsuit, I sat at the dining table with the envelope spread open, like a wound that refused to close. The accusations were bold enough to be insulting, but vague enough to suggest they hoped I would panic instead of investigate. Panic was not something West Point trained into officers. Investigation, however, had been woven deeply into my work for years. If they wanted a legal battle, then the first step was understanding exactly who they were now and who they had always been. I logged into public databases using the same methodical patience I used in Afghanistan. Names first, addresses next, employment histories, court filings, county records, unclaimed property databases, bankruptcy logs. The digital world is full of shadows people forget they leave behind. The deeper I dug, the fewer surprises remained. Linda and Mark Dawson had lived in Waco for years, moving between small rental houses with irregular payments. Their employment records were inconsistent. Mark had worked at a mechanic shop for a few months at a time before quitting. Linda held temporary cashier positions, but rarely stayed longer than a season. The real pattern emerged when I searched court filings. One after another, entries began appearing across the screen. Civil disputes, collection agency suits, past due loans, and then the unmistakable pattern: gambling debts. 5 separate claims from 3 different establishments had been filed between 1993 and 1997, right around the time they abandoned me. The amounts were not enormous individually, but combined, they painted a picture of 2 people drowning financially and looking for someone or something to blame. It was not the debt itself that chilled me. It was the dates. I traced the timeline until I found an entry from early November of 1996. The same week they drove me to the gate at Fort Hood. A casino 20 miles outside Waco filed a complaint against Mark for unpaid credit. A handwritten note from the casino manager included the phrase, "Customer claimed financial hardship." My hands tightened around the mouse. Hardship. They used my life as a balancing act for their finances. And when they could not manage it, they simply decided I was too heavy a burden. I continued reading until another trend crept into view. Charges for petty fraud, shoplifting, check forgery. Some had been dismissed, others settled quietly. But together they aligned with the type of instability that often leads people to desperate decisions. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the truth of who they had been long before they claimed to be grieving parents. The file search continued through state databases. A few results froze me where I sat. A family dispute record from 1995 involving Linda's sister. The statement described verbal aggression escalating to physical intimidation. The police report concluded with a note stating prior concerns about possible emotional mistreatment within the household. That line tightened something in my chest. Abandonment had not been an impulsive mistake. It had been the culmination of patterns stretching far before my birth. When I located archived residential records, I found something even more revealing. Their rental application from 1996 listed household size as 2 adults. No children. They had filed taxes that same year, claiming no dependents. They had lived their lives as though I had never existed. It was erasure in its purest form. Not the kind caused by losing someone, but the kind that results from discarding them. I stared at the tax form on the screen for several minutes. I remembered the night at the gate, the warmth of the Texas air, the pulse of red and blue lights, the slow creeping dread as time passed. They had made a decision before driving away, and then they repeated that decision again and again, on every form they ever signed. In their world, I had stopped existing before the car even turned onto the road. Wanting more than digital traces, I contacted an old colleague from my intelligence days who now worked in a private investigative agency. I explained the situation carefully without revealing more than necessary. He agreed to pull deeper background checks as long as everything remained within legal boundaries. 2 days later, he sent me a folder that made my stomach twist with a mix of anger and clarity. Their neighbors from the late 90s described the Dawsons as volatile. One remembered hearing shouting late at night. Another recalled Linda telling people that she never wanted kids. A third mentioned Mark blaming financial struggles on a child they were caring for temporarily. Temporarily. That word cut with a clean edge. It meant they never intended permanence, never intended responsibility, never intended me. I clicked into another document. It was a scanned copy of a complaint from the Texas Office of Child Services filed in mid-1996. A social worker had visited their residence due to concerns reported by a relative. The Dawsons insisted they had no children. The case was closed. When I read that line, a strange mix of grief and strength rose inside me. They had erased me long before I learned how to spell my own name. I gathered every document and printed each page. Laying the pages side by side across the table created a mosaic of the truth. Not a story of parental love gone wrong, but a pattern of evasion, deceit, and self-preservation. In the center of the pages, I placed the lawsuit they filed against me. The contrast was blinding. Their claims of loving me, their claims of searching for me, their claims of suffering. None of it survived even the faintest inspection. Lies disintegrate under light. I was still scanning the last page when the house grew quiet in the way that only memories can shape silence. I looked toward the general's study where stacks of his books still lined the shelves. He had always believed truth had a way of standing on its own. He taught me that integrity is not merely how you act, but how you confront what others try to hide. With the documents spread across the table, I felt something shift. The abandoned child who once sat outside the gate did not vanish. She simply grew strong enough to face what happened. And now, with every record, every line, every signature, the past revealed itself not as a mystery, but as evidence. If you have ever fought to uncover the truth behind your own story, leave a like, so I know you are here. The more I uncovered about the Dawsons, the clearer it became that I could not simply react to their lawsuit. I needed to confront it with the same discipline I used in every mission briefing. Facts, evidence, structure, precision. Emotion could come later, but never first. I contacted the JAG Corps office at Fort Bragg where I was stationed at the time. Although the case would proceed in civilian court, the military provided guidance for service members navigating legal disputes connected to their personal lives. That was how I met Captain Maria Torres. She entered the consultation room with a folder tucked under her arm and a calm that reminded me of seasoned officers who had seen more than they discussed. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly and her uniform carried the sharp lines of someone who respected every detail. After a brief introduction, she asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I told her about the lawsuit, the abandonment, and the inheritance. When I finished, her expression had not changed, but her pen had stopped moving. Major Carver, this is not a simple dispute. They are attempting to rewrite history. We will not allow that. She slid the legal packet across the table and tapped the first page. Their claims rely entirely on the assumption that no record exists contradicting their story. So our job is to gather every record that does. She began listing steps with the same cadence she might use to plan an operation. First, we request archived military police reports from Fort Hood. Next, we obtain CPS documentation from Texas. Then we secure authenticated adoption records from the state. We will also need gate logs from that night if they still exist. And of course, the general's will. I understood each piece carried weight, but together they formed something more powerful than testimony. They formed the truth. Captain Torres drafted release forms and explained the timeline. Some documents would take days to retrieve, others weeks. We would need certified scans, notarized affidavits, and official timestamps. Civil court demanded clear lines of custody for every piece of evidence. I watched her organize the checklist and felt a familiar steadiness rise inside me. This was not fear anymore. It was purpose. When the request for the MP report came back, it included the name I had kept tucked in memory since childhood. Sergeant Keller. His handwriting filled the incident form. Time of discovery. Location. Condition of minor. Description of events. The report also included a short note summarizing witness reactions at the gate. One sentence stood out clearly. Child appears to have been intentionally left without supervision. The words were clinical, but I could feel the sharpness within them. Torres placed a small yellow tab beside that line. This alone discredits half their claims. But we are not stopping here. Next came the CPS file. When the envelope arrived, Torres and I sat at a long table in the legal office going page by page. The records revealed everything I had researched about their rental history and their repeated claim in 1996 that they had no children. The caseworker's summary included the phrase, "guardians unreachable after multiple attempts." Another pillar of their fabricated story collapsed. Then came the adoption file. A stamped court decree dated 1997 stated clearly that parental rights of Linda and Mark Dawson had been terminated due to abandonment and non-participation in proceedings. A second decree documented that the adoption by General Carver met all legal requirements. Torres placed another yellow tab. They claimed they were denied parental rights. This proves they forfeited them willingly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The truth did not merely contradict their lawsuit, it dismantled it. The gate log arrived last, a digitized file from Fort Hood's security archive. The footage was grainy and old, but recognizable. A small figure sat near the fence. A vehicle approached. The headlights washed over the child, then the car drove away. A timestamp flashed across the lower corner. The license plate was partially visible and matched the Dawson's registration from that year. I felt my breath pause. Even though the memory was etched into me, seeing it on a screen brought back the heat, the lights, the silence. Torres studied the footage without speaking. After several long seconds, she exhaled quietly. "This is more than enough." Still, she retrieved one final packet of documents. The general's will. His signatures were crisp and unmistakable. The language was straightforward. He left his estate to me without condition. Not as restitution, not as compensation, but as his chosen heir. Torres looked at me after reviewing the entire file. "Major, this case is not about money. It is about two people who abandoned a child and then returned when they saw opportunity. Our job is to present the facts clearly so the court understands the full picture." She handed me a pen. "Sign here to authorize the full counter-filing." My name felt heavier than usual as I wrote it. It was not just my signature. It was a declaration. I would not allow them to shape my narrative. I would not allow them to use the general's death as their leverage, and I would not let the child at the gate stand alone again. Torres gathered the documents into a thick folder and closed it with a firm motion. "This is no longer a defense. This is an offensive strategy. The law is on your side. The truth is on your side. Now we present it. If you were in my position and believed some battles must be fought to the very end, comment, fight. If you think forgiveness is a path of its own, comment, forgive." I looked at the stack of evidence one last time. Every page felt like a step forward from the past and toward justice. I had spent my life learning how to fight with clarity and purpose. This battle would be no different. The federal courtroom in Raleigh carried the kind of silence that feels rehearsed. Heavy wooden doors, polished floors, flags perfectly spaced behind the judge's bench. It was not a military proceeding, but because I was an active duty officer and the case involved a four-star general's estate, the hearing had been moved to a federal venue with security measures that felt unmistakably familiar to anyone who lived their life in uniform. Reporters waited outside hours before the session began. Some recognized me from the funeral broadcast. Others recognized the headline that had gone viral the night before. Parents sue decorated Army officer for $6 million inheritance. My name trended online before I ever stepped into the building. I arrived early with Captain Torres. She walked beside me with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for every possible outcome. My uniform felt heavier than usual, not from nerves but from meaning. The courtroom doors opened with a soft echo and every head turned. People always turned when an officer entered a public space in full-dress uniform, but this time recognition flickered across several faces. Whispers rose like wind passing through tall grass. That's her, the one they abandoned, the millionaire major, the general's daughter. I kept my expression steady. One thing the military teaches you is stillness under scrutiny. I walked to the defendant's table and sat down slowly, placing my hands deliberately on the polished wood. A minute later, the door on the opposite side of the courtroom opened. Linda and Mark Dawson stepped inside. Even from a distance, I could see how carefully they had been coached. Linda wore a soft cardigan, a shape chosen to evoke vulnerability. Mark kept his head down and his shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying the invisible weight of imagined grief. They looked smaller in person than they did in my memories, but their eyes, those had not changed, calculating, restless, searching for the angle, not the truth. The whispering around us intensified. Several people looked between me and them as if trying to map the connection. Most could not. Nothing about them suggested military life. Nothing about them suggested integrity or discipline. But public opinion is built on stories, not facts, and the Dawsons knew that. Their attorney positioned them near the front row, leaning in to whisper instructions with practiced sympathy. When the judge entered the room, everyone stood. His gaze moved across the courtroom landing, briefly on my uniform, then on the plaintiff's, then on the stack of documents arranged neatly on the clerk's desk. The hearing began with procedural statements. The Dawsons' attorney rose dramatically. "Your Honor, my clients have endured unimaginable pain. Their daughter was taken from them without consent. For decades they believed she was lost. Only recently did they learn she had been illegally adopted by a high-ranking military official, denying them the opportunity to raise their own child." Gasps echoed from one side of the courtroom. The performance landed exactly as they intended. Words crafted to provoke sympathy struck like carefully placed stage lights. I kept my eyes forward. Torres had instructed me not to react. "Silence is more powerful than interruption," the attorney continued. "Furthermore, Major Carver has unjustly inherited $6 million that rightfully belongs to the biological family. My clients seek restitution for emotional suffering, financial denial, and decades of lost parenthood." He placed a hand dramatically on Linda's shoulder. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she had prepared long before she entered the courtroom. Mark looked down at the floor as though unable to bear the weight of memory. It was a performance crafted to perfection. But performances crumble when forced to stand beside truth. Torres stood next. Unlike their attorney, she did not raise her voice. She did not gesture wildly. She simply spoke with the steady cadence of a trained officer addressing a room with facts, not theatrics. "Your Honor, the adoption was lawful. The plaintiffs abandoned the minor at the gate of a United States Army installation on August 14, 1996. They denied having a child in multiple legal documents that same year. They forfeited their parental rights through non-participation in state proceedings. Every assertion made by the plaintiffs can be disproven through certified federal and state records, which this court will review." She paused, letting the simplicity of that statement settle. Not emotion, evidence. A quiet ripple moved through the room. The judge nodded, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. "Fact patterns matter in federal court." Then came the portion I had anticipated least. The Dawsons took the stand. Linda went first. She stepped carefully to the witness chair, her cardigan arranged just loosely enough to appear fragile. Her voice shook at the beginning. "We never wanted to give her up. We were young. We were confused. We thought the army took her from us, and we were too afraid to fight back. I watched her closely. Not one word aligned with the night at the gate. Not one detail held truth. She described me as a child who wandered away. She said they searched for me daily. She said the general manipulated the system. The courtroom listened with the uneasy suspension reserved for stories impossible to verify without evidence. But evidence was exactly what they lacked. Mark followed repeating her claims with slightly less finesse. His lies were rough at the edges. He contradicted her twice. Torres wrote each contradiction down calmly for later use. As they spoke, subtle shifts spread across the spectators. Folded arms, raised eyebrows, murmurs questioning logic. Online, the reaction was louder. During a recess, Torres showed me the trending thread. How did they lose track of a 6-year-old at a military base gate? How did they not file a report? Why did they claim no dependence on tax forms? Logic is a powerful force when emotion fades. When the judge reconvened, he looked between both tables as if measuring something invisible. He announced that the plaintiff's statements would be reviewed and that all evidence would be examined before the next hearing. Then his gaze moved to me. "Major Carver, you have chosen not to testify today." I nodded. "That is correct, Your Honor." He studied me for a brief moment. "Your silence is noted. It was not judgment. It was recognition. Some things are more powerful when held until the right moment." As the session ended, chatter erupted instantly. People dissected the contradictions. Reporters rushed to the hallway. Online platforms lit up with theories, analyses, and indignation. And through it all, I remained quiet. Not because I lacked a voice, but because truth does not need to shout. It only needs its moment. And mine was coming. The second hearing drew a larger crowd than the first. Word had spread through veteran forums, local news stations, and military family networks across North Carolina. People who had never met me came because they had children of their own. They came because something about my story made them furious in a personal way, the kind of fury that sits low and tight in the chest. By the time I stepped into the courtroom, the gallery was full. Active duty soldiers in uniform sat beside retirees in ball caps embroidered with Vietnam and Desert Storm. Civilian families filled the remaining seats, leaning forward in expectation. They were not here for drama. They were here for clarity, public exposure. Moment number 2 was about to unfold. Captain Torres stood beside me, reviewing the sequence one last time. She did not need to. Every detail had been drilled into place through weeks of preparation. Today, we were going to show the court the truth that Linda and Mark Dawson had buried under 3 decades of lies. When the judge entered the room, the silence snapped into place like a parade command. The plaintiffs shifted nervously. Their attorney tried to mask his unease, but his movements were jerky, unfocused. He knew what was coming. Evidence leaves no room for creativity. The judge called the session to order, and Torres rose. "Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit 12 through Exhibit 24. These items consist of military police documentation from Fort Hood, Texas, dated August 14, 1996, as well as sworn testimony from the responding officer and supplemental records from the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Torres approached the bench with the calm stride of someone crossing a finish line she had been sprinting toward for years. She handed the binder to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. He flipped open to the first tab. The room leaned in collectively. Torres began. The responding military police officer on duty that night was Sergeant First Class Daniel Keller. He is now retired. The gallery stirred. Anyone familiar with the Army knew what MP patrol logs looked like. They were precise, time-stamped, unemotional. Torres clicked a small remote, and the screen beside the bench lit up. A grainy black-and-white image appeared. Gate Cam 2 Fort Hood, August 14, 1996, 21:13 hours. The footage was old and partially degraded, but still readable. On the screen, headlights approached the main gate. A pause, a door opening, a small figure stepping out. Me, 6 years old, barely visible except for the outline of my small frame in the beam of the vehicle's headlights. The gallery inhaled sharply. Then the car door closed. A second pause. The vehicle, pulling away. the same license plate later filed in the MP logbook. The Dawsons' license plate. Their attorney shifted uncomfortably. The judge leaned forward, studying the timestamp closely. Torres continued, her voice unwavering. Your Honor, the plaintiffs testified that they lost their child at a crowded public area. They claimed confusion, panic, and interference by Army personnel. This footage shows a different reality. Their vehicle left the installation border voluntarily without the minor. She allowed the next slide to appear. The MP incident report. Clean, bold, typewritten lines. At 21:15 hours, Sergeant Keller discovered a minor female alone outside Gate 2. The minor appeared cold and distressed. No adult present. Child reported parents said, "Stay here." Keller notified chain of command and CPS as required. The judge read silently, his expression tightening. The gallery was no longer quiet. Whispered disbelief swept through the room like a sudden storm front. People shook their heads, arms crossing over chests, jaws clenching. Some of the veterans muttered under their breath, "You do not abandon a child at a military gate. Not in peacetime, not in war, not ever." Torres called the witness. The defense requests testimony from Sergeant First Class Daniel Keller, retired. Keller rose from the second row of seating, walking with the slight stiffness of a man whose knees had earned their age through service, not neglect. He wore a suit, but carried himself like uniformed discipline had never left his bones. He took the oath and sat. Torres approached. "Sergeant Keller, can you describe the condition of the child that night?" His voice was steady. She was shaking, hungry, wearing shoes that were too small and a shirt too thin for the evening temperature. She kept asking if they were coming back. The gallery went silent, the painful kind. Did they return? Keller shook his head. "No, ma'am. They never came back to the gate. They never contacted the MPs the next day or the day after. Records show no inquiry from the plaintiffs at any time." The judge looked directly at the Dawsons for the first time that morning. Their faces had gone gray. Linda's hands trembled. Mark stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Torres moved to the next piece of evidence. CPS intake forms from 1996 indicated that both plaintiffs listed themselves as having no dependent children during that year. This is signed and notarized. She held up the document so the clerk could confirm it. The Dawsons' attorney raised an objection, weak and unfocused, but the judge overruled him immediately. The facts were too clear to ignore. Torres ended with the final blow. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs have presented themselves as grieving parents who searched tirelessly for their missing child. The official records contradict this entirely. They did not report her missing. They did not contact authorities. They did not attempt recovery. They declared themselves childless. They abandoned her. This is not speculation. This is documented fact." The judge closed the binder slowly, not dramatically, just decisively. He looked at the Dawsons again, and something shifted in the room. Respect does not have to be said. Neither does contempt. Linda began to cry, the same staged trembling as before, but this time no one reacted with sympathy. People in the gallery stared at her with cold disbelief. Public opinion had turned, completely. The truth was no longer a debate. It was a verdict forming in real time. I watched quietly, hands folded, breathing steady. For 28 years, I had carried the memory of that night alone. Now the world finally saw it. Not through my words, through theirs. Their car, their plate, their choices. Evidence is the purest form of justice. The judge spoke. "The court will take a short recess. The review of these materials will continue this afternoon, but let me state clearly, what I have seen raises significant concerns." His pause was deliberate. "About the credibility of the plaintiffs." The murmurs surged again, breaking through the solemn air. Captain Torres closed the binder and glanced at me with a small, almost hidden nod. It was not victory, not yet, but the ground beneath the Dawsons had cracked, and cracks always spread. The hearing adjourned for the day, but the public reaction did not. By the time I walked out of the courthouse into the warm, late afternoon air of Raleigh, the story had already spread. Not because I had spoken, but because the evidence had spoken for me. News vans idled outside the security barrier. Retired soldiers formed small circles, shaking their heads in disgust. Military spouses clutched their bags a little tighter, whispering about what kind of people could do such a thing. I slipped into my vehicle quietly, using the rear exit to avoid attention. What I did not expect was that less than 24 hours later, the Dawsons' next move would not be legal. It would be personal. It happened on a Sunday morning, a still morning where the haze over Fayetteville softened everything in sight. I was on my porch watering the potted rosemary General Carver had planted years ago when I saw a fading blue sedan pull into my driveway. I did not tense. Years in military intelligence trained me to stay still, first assess second. The doors opened. Linda stepped out, clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. Mark followed slower eyes, sweeping the porch like he was approaching a commanding officer. Their nerve was almost impressive. I did not move from the steps. I simply placed the watering can down and waited. They walked toward me like relatives visiting for the holidays instead of plaintiffs who had just been exposed for abandoning a child at a military gate. Linda forced a trembling smile. "Elise, honey, we need to talk." I raised an eyebrow. That was all. It was enough to make her swallow hard. Mark cleared his throat. "What happened in court yesterday? It was hard on all of us." All of us. The audacity rattled through me like a low drumbeat. I did not respond, so he continued. "We know mistakes were made, but that was a long time ago. People change, families heal." Linda stepped forward, hands twisting together until her knuckles whitened. "We're still your parents, no matter what." The words hung in the air with a kind of sour weight. They expected me to fill the silence with emotion, shock, maybe even longing. They still believed I needed something from them. She continued when I did not speak. "If you could just share a portion of the inheritance, not all of it. Just a fair amount. Something to help us get back on our feet." 30 years, I said calmly, letting each syllable fall with sharp precision. "That is how long you managed without me." They froze. Mark blinked first. "Elise, you do not understand what we were going through. We were in debt, yes, but we were under pressure. We were young. We panicked." My voice remained level. "You drove me to a military installation in the dark. You told me to stand still. Then you left." Linda's face crumpled into a controlled sob, the same pattern I had seen in the courtroom. Shoulders shaking, just enough voice cracking, just enough eyes glistening, but never spilling over. A performance polished through years of manipulation. "We lost our daughter," she whispered. "We were devastated." I tilted my head. "No, you discarded your daughter. You did not lose me. You left me. Your car is in the gate log. You signed documents claiming you had no child. You never filed a missing person report. You never called an MP desk. You never tried." Her mouth opened and closed helplessly. Her performance had run out of rehearsed lines. Mark tried a different tactic. "Look, you have something now. Something big. $6 million is a life changer. General Carver would have wanted you to help us. You think you know what he would have wanted." He straightened his shirt collar. "Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he manipulated you. Maybe this whole thing with your adoption." His voice trailed off when he saw my eyes. Calm, cold, absolutely unshaken. "Do not speak about him again," I said. The tone was not loud, but it was the tone soldiers respond to instinctively. The tone that ends conversations. Mark stiffened and stepped back. I rose from the porch seat and walked down 2 steps until I stood eye level with both of them. "You came here to ask for forgiveness, but forgiveness is earned. You came here to ask for money, but money is owed to those who act with honor, and you have never once done that." Linda wiped her cheek with trembling fingers. "Elise, please. We are your family. Say something. I am saying something. You are not my family. Family does not abandon a child at a restricted entry point and drive away. Family does not forget. Family does not reappear only when money becomes involved." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of someone grilling in a distant yard. A dog barked 2 houses down, and the 2 people who had once decided my life was worth less than their debts now stood on my porch as if expecting a reunion. The moment crystallized inside me. Not triumph, not rage, just clarity. The clarity that comes with choosing who you are, no longer obligated to be. I gestured toward their car. This conversation is over. Linda stepped forward in a last attempt. Elise, we are your blood. I shook my head. Blood is biology. Loyalty is choice. Character is action. Mark opened his mouth again, but I cut him off with a single sentence. You abandoned me at 6 years old. You do not get to return at 34 and ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not money, not a place in my life. The porch light above us flickered gently in the breeze, and for a moment none of us spoke. Then I ended it. Leave. Now. Something hardened behind Mark's eyes. The mask cracked just enough to show what lay underneath. Greed turning to anger. Entitlement turning to resentment. You will regret this, he muttered. I gave a small, controlled smile. No. For the first time, I will not. They walked back to their car, their steps unsteady. They had come expecting weakness. They had come expecting emotional leverage. Instead, they found steel. As the sedan rolled out of my driveway, dust lifting behind it, I turned back toward the house and closed the door with deliberate calm. They thought they had witnessed my final answer, but they had not yet understood the full reach of consequences. The law had not spoken. The public had not reacted to their visit, and the next hearing would be the one that carried weight. The door clicked shut behind me. Their audacity had returned. Now justice would. The third hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, but by the time I arrived, the courthouse felt like the aftermath of a storm. Reporters lined the barricades. Military families held folders tight to their chests. Veterans in faded caps stood shoulder to shoulder as if forming an honor guard. They were not here for the Dawsons. They were here because abandoning a child at a military gate cuts deeper than a headline. It violates something sacred. Inside the courtroom was already full. The judge sat straighter than usual, his expression carved from stone. The clerk shuffled through the docket with quick, tight movements. Even the air felt tense like the moment before a commander issues an order. I took my seat at the defense table, my uniform pressed so sharply it could have cut through the tension itself. Captain Torres slid a small packet of notes toward me, but I did not look at them. I knew what I needed to say. I had been carrying those words for 28 years. When the Dawsons entered, they walked as though the previous hearings had been inconveniences rather than unravelings. Linda wore muted makeup to appear fragile. Mark's jaw was set in a stubborn line, as if defiance alone could change the facts. Their attorney, however, looked gray and exhausted. He knew what was coming. The judge opened the session with calm authority. We will continue reviewing evidence regarding the plaintiff's petition for inheritance claim. However, new concerns have been raised that require clarification, meaning this hearing would no longer be about whether they should receive money. It would be about whether they had committed crimes in 2 different decades. Their attorney rose quickly. Your Honor, before the defense presents further material, the plaintiffs would like to restate that they are grieving parents who... The judge held up a hand. Sit. The command cracked through the room like a rifle report. This is the final opportunity for clarity. After today, this court will make referrals where appropriate. The attorney swallowed hard and sat. The judge turned to me. Major Carver, the court invites any statement you wish to provide. The room shifted. Dozens of eyes turned to me, anticipating something explosive or emotional. But when I stood, my posture remained even steady, controlled. I walked to the center of the courtroom floor, where sunlight cut through the high window and fell in a single sharp line across the carpet. My boots stopped directly in it. I faced the judge first. Your Honor, I would like to provide clarification regarding one point repeatedly misstated by the plaintiffs. Then I turned. I looked at Linda and Mark. I let silence stretch just long enough for everyone in the room to feel it tighten. You didn't lose me. You abandoned me. Gasps scattered through the gallery. One elderly veteran whispered something low and furious under his breath. I continued. You drove me to Fort Hood. You told me to stay still. You left me standing in darkness next to a restricted military checkpoint. You did not file a report. You did not return. You did not ask a single question for the next 28 years. Linda's carefully painted expression crumbled. Mark clenched the table so hard his knuckles went white. Their attorney rose abruptly. "Objection, the defense is engaging in emotional." "Overruled," the judge said instantly. The objection died on the attorney's tongue. I went on. "The plaintiffs claim they were victims of confusion, but the gate log shows their vehicle leaving alone. The plaintiffs claim they searched, but CPS documents show they declared themselves childless. The plaintiffs claim they were denied the chance to raise their daughter, but they chose to remove themselves from her life." The judge's expression hardened with every word. This was not just testimony, this was a timeline of truth. Their attorney tried again, voice cracking slightly. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs were young. They were overwhelmed. The court must consider what exactly?" Torres said, rising smoothly. "That they signed sworn documents stating they had no children, that they left a 6-year-old outside a secured Army facility, which constitutes child endangerment under Texas law." The judge nodded slowly. "The court is indeed considering that." The attorney's face drained of color. He tried one last angle. "Major Carver is benefiting unfairly from the estate of a man who was not her real father." I faced him fully. General Raymond Carver was more of a father than they ever attempted to be. He found me when they left me. He protected me when they forgot me. He raised me when they erased me. That is the definition of real. Linda finally broke. Tears spilled as she stood abruptly. "We were scared. We were broke. We were drowning. We made mistakes, but we loved you." I kept my gaze steady. "You loved the idea of what I could give you. When I was a burden, you abandoned me. When I became valuable, you sued me." Mark's voice cracked like a brittle branch. "We deserve a chance to make things right." I shook my head. "You had 30 years. The judge tapped his gavel once. "Enough." His voice carried the finality of a closing hatch on an armored vehicle. "The plaintiff's credibility is in serious question. This court is now compelled to consider referral for potential charges including child abandonment pertaining to the 1996 incident, as well as possible fraud and perjury connected to statements made during these proceedings." The gallery erupted in a wave of murmurs, anger, outrage, vindication. The Dawsons' attorney slumped into his seat. Linda covered her face. Mark stared down at the table as if the wood grain might offer escape. The judge continued. "The court will finalize judgment on the inheritance petition shortly, but make no mistake, the trajectory of this case has shifted." He glanced toward the bailiff. "Ensure the plaintiffs remain available for further questioning." The bailiff nodded. The message was unmistakable. The Dawsons had walked into this courtroom expecting wealth. They would leave it facing consequences. I stepped back toward the defense table, the judge's words still echoing across the chamber. This was not just a legal victory forming. This was the world finally naming what had happened to me. Not misfortune, not confusion, not a tragic accident. Abandonment. And now the law was preparing to speak. The courtroom felt different the morning of the final ruling. Not tense, not chaotic, but charged like the quiet hum inside a command center, right before a mission goes live. Every seat was filled again. Veterans in crisp polos, Army spouses clutching notebooks, retirees with steady, knowing eyes. They came because justice inside a military community is personal. When a child is harmed near a base, it is not just a family matter. It violates the fabric of who they are. Captain Torres and I sat at the defense table reviewing nothing. There was nothing left to review. The evidence had already spoken the truth, had already landed, and the Dawsons had nothing left but the thin hope of mercy from a system they had tried to exploit. When they entered the room, did not turn to them with curiosity. It turned with judgment, not the legal kind, the human kind. The kind you cannot wipe away with rehearsed tears or hollow words. Linda walked with small broken steps, her eyes swollen. Mark walked stiffly, jaw tight, trying to cling to a veneer of dignity that had long since cracked. Their attorney followed like a man walking behind a sinking ship. The judge entered. The gallery rose. Even before he spoke, I could feel the outcome in the room. "Some judgments are not surprises. They are confirmations." He took his seat and folded his hands. After reviewing all evidence testimony and legal filings in the matter of Dawson v. Carver regarding inheritance petition and claims of unlawful adoption, the court finds as follows. The room froze. No coughs, no shuffling, just breath held in collective anticipation. The plaintiff's petition is denied in full. A sound rippled through the gallery, not a shout, not a gasp, but a low exhale of relief. The judge continued. The evidence indicates that the plaintiffs knowingly abandoned their minor child on August 14, 1996 at the main gate of Fort Hood, Texas. Statements submitted in their petition contradict documented records provided by Military Police Child Protective Services and the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. He paused, a pause meant to settle the gravity of what came next. Furthermore, sworn statements made by the plaintiffs during these proceedings appear inconsistent with factual records and may constitute perjury. The plaintiffs' history of representing themselves as childless while accepting financial benefits from relief groups and local organizations in the year 1996 raises additional concern over possible fraudulent activity. The Dawsons' attorney rose as if to object, then slowly sat back down. He knew there was nothing left to say. Therefore, the court is referring this case and all associated documents to the Office of the District Attorney for Bell County, Texas, for possible prosecution related to child abandonment, fraud, and perjury. The gallery erupted. It was not chaotic applause, but a sharp, unified break of emotion. People clapped with the force of years of indignation. Veterans nodded firmly. Military wives wiped tears. A retired sergeant called out under his breath about time. The judge lifted a hand, and the applause softened but did not fully die. This was more than a ruling. It was a public reckoning. And public humiliation for the Dawsons had arrived with devastating clarity. Linda crumpled into her chair, clutching her purse like it might stop her world from collapsing. Mark's face drained of color, his hands trembling for the first time since the trial began. They had come here expecting wealth. They left with the weight of legal consequences closing in. The judge closed the folder with a decisive click. Major Carver, the court acknowledges the exceptional conduct you have demonstrated throughout these proceedings. Your restraint and professionalism reflect the highest standards of military service. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court. Gratitude, not pity, not sympathy, recognition. I rose with a deliberate breath. Not victorious, not vindictive, but steady. This was not revenge. This was justice. As I turned, the gallery stood. Veterans, spouses, retirees, civilians all rising in a gesture that was not required but offered freely. A gesture of respect, a gesture of solidarity. I walked down the center aisle, the same aisle where my parents had once tried to paint themselves as victims. I did not look at them. They no longer held any part of my story. At the doorway, sunlight poured in from tall panes of glass. I paused. For a moment, I thought of the 6-year-old girl standing outside Fort Hood under the blare of red and blue gate lights clutching nothing but fear. I wished she could see this moment, that she could see the truth finally named and acknowledged by an entire room of people. If you believe justice truly won today, comment "Justice for Elise." Torres joined me in the hallway. "That is one of the cleanest rulings I have ever seen," she said. "You presented the truth with strength." I nodded. Strength was not something I was born with. It was something forged through abandonment, rebuilt through discipline, and sharpened through service. Outside, a reporter called my name, but I walked past them all. Not out of avoidance, out of completion. This chapter was finished. The law had spoken, and the world had witnessed it. News travels fast in military towns, but it travels even faster in small civilian pockets built around them. By the time the judge's ruling reached the public record, the Dawsons' reputation in Waco, Texas had already collapsed. It started with a single headline on a regional news site: "Couple accused of abandoning child at Fort Hood faces investigation." Then local radio stations picked it up. Then church groups. Then the neighborhood Facebook pages where gossip spreads like wildfire wrapped in gasoline. Within 48 hours, the Dawsons went from being that quiet couple who kept to themselves to the center of every whispered conversation in every grocery aisle, church lobby, and workplace break room. Their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, told reporters she remembered Linda borrowing sugar on the same week she claimed in court she had been grieving the loss of her child. Another neighbor recalled seeing a new car in their driveway around late 1996, the same year they received money from charitable groups while claiming hardship. The disconnect between their words and the truth was too large to reconcile. Waco is not the kind of town that forgets what happens to children real or adopted or fostered. People there understand that communities survive only when children are protected. When the truth broke that the Dawsons had abandoned me at a military gate and later exploited organizations with false claims about losing a child, the anger became something deeper. It became rejection. Mailboxes stopped receiving holiday cards. Church invitations went silent. Neighbors who once waved politely now crossed the street. Linda tried to go to the grocery store one morning, and a woman she had known for 15 years asked her directly, "How could you leave a 6-year-old alone in the dark?" Linda had no answer. She simply abandoned her shopping cart and walked out. Meanwhile, the Bell County District Attorney's Office opened its formal inquiry. The investigators contacted the Army for archived MP records. They requested CPS files. They issued subpoenas for financial records from 1996 to determine whether charitable funds had been misused and whether the couple had filed accurate tax documentation that year. Fraud is a heavy word in small towns, heavier still when it touches public trust. Reporters stood outside the Dawson home cameras ready while Mark pretended not to notice them. He yelled once, shouting that the story was one-sided, that they were victims of a misunderstanding, that the court had made a mistake. But even he knew the truth was no longer something he could bend. It was written in timestamps, signatures, and gate logs. I watched none of this with satisfaction. Not because I felt sympathy, but because revenge had never been my mission. My mission had been clarity, justice, a record corrected, a truth named. Their downfall was not something I needed to witness. It was simply the natural consequence of years of lies coming home to roost. Instead, I focused on the one place that still held the imprint of who I once was. 2 weeks after the ruling, I drove to Fort Hood. Not as an officer returning for duty, not as the adopted daughter of a 4-star general, but as the grown woman who had once stood trembling outside its gate. The road looked exactly the same. Long stretches of Texas asphalt running beside chain-link fencing and scrub brush. The sun hung low and gold behind the motor pool horizon. When I reached the main gate, I parked across from the visitor center and stepped out. The heat wrapped around me immediately, thick and familiar. A young MP stood at the booth, posture-crisp uniform, immaculate. He glanced at me politely, then noticed my rank and straightened further. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I assist you?" "No need," I said gently. "I'm just here for a moment." He nodded respectfully and returned to his post. I walked slowly toward the exact patch of gravel where Sergeant Keller had found me 28 years earlier. The gate lights flashed red and blue in the distance. The same lights that had once felt overwhelming now looked like beacons of structure and protection. I closed my eyes and let the memory surface. The cold, the silence, the fear of not knowing whether anyone would ever come back. That night had branded itself into my childhood, like a scar shaping my understanding of abandonment, trust, and survival. But standing there as Major Elise Carver, I felt something different. Not pain, not grief. Peace. I opened my eyes. For years I had believed this place represented the moment my life fell apart. But it was also the moment my life was redirected. If the Dawsons had not left me here, General Raymond Carver would never have crossed my path. I would never have learned discipline, courage, or integrity from a man who embodied all three. I would never have discovered the resilience that carried me through West Point, the Intelligence Corps deployments and trials far greater than this one. I would never have become the woman capable of standing in a courtroom and speaking the truth with clarity instead of fear. Sometimes the places where we break become the places where we rise. I stood there until the sun dipped lower. Vehicles rolled through the checkpoint, soldiers returning from duty, families heading home, life continuing unbroken. A soft breeze brushed past me, warm and quiet. I thought of General Carver, of how he spoke with deliberate calm, of how he believed that honor was not a decoration but a decision made daily. I whispered into the fading light, "Thank you. Thank you for stopping that night. Thank you for choosing me." As I returned to my car, the young MP called out, "Have a good evening, ma'am?" I smiled. "You too, soldier." I got in, closed the door gently, and took one last look at the gate. For the first time in my life, it no longer represented abandonment. It represented survival. And it represented the beginning of everything that had made me strong. In the months after the trial, life did not return to normal because there was no normal to return to. I had stepped out of one identity, an abandoned child surviving on instinct, and fully into another, a woman who finally owned her story. But something lingered in me, a sense that the verdict, as powerful as it was, could not be the final chapter. Justice had been served for me. But what about the others? Children who slipped through the cracks near bases. Children who waited alone in visitor centers during custody battles. Children who had no voice in communities defined by constant movement, deployment, separation, and sacrifice. Military towns are strong, but even strong places have shadows. And I knew exactly what lived inside those shadows' silence. The same silence that wrapped itself around me outside the Fort Hood gate in 1996. The same silence that followed me through foster interviews, school hallways, military barracks, and even promotions. Silence can destroy, but it can also sharpen. It can teach you to listen beyond words, to read danger before it arrives, to recognize loneliness in the eyes of a child before the child even understands it. And so I chose to build something with that silence. Not a memorial, a mission. The Carver Military Children Foundation officially launched 9 months after the trial. We filed paperwork in a small office in downtown Fayetteville, 1 block from a diner that still served the same cornbread General Carver used to order after training days. The foundation's mission was simple but unprecedented: protect, support, and defend children affected by instability in military communities, especially those who had been abandoned, displaced, or overlooked. We started small, as all honest missions do. 1 caseworker, 1 legal advocate, 1 tiny conference room with peeling paint and a borrowed filing cabinet. But momentum builds when purpose is real. Veterans volunteered, military spouses volunteered, school counselors volunteered. Even active duty soldiers used their 1 day off to fix office wiring, assemble furniture, or deliver donated backpacks to kids living off base. Within 4 months, we expanded into a larger building. By the end of the year, we had secured federal grants and forged partnerships with military family readiness units at 7 installations across the country. We established a hotline, a direct line for any child or guardian near a base who needed emergency assistance, legal guidance, or simply a steady voice in moments of fear. I personally trained every staff member in trauma-informed communication because I remembered too clearly what it felt like to be 6 years old and spoken to like an afterthought. We gave these children what I once needed: attention, safety, dignity, options. One evening, after a 14-hour day of reviewing case summaries, I walked into my office to find Megan, my adoptive cousin, in every way that mattered, sorting through toy donations. She looked up and smiled, soft and steady. "You know he'd be proud of you," she said. I did not reply at first. I turned toward the largest frame on my wall, the one that held the photograph of General Raymond Carver in full 4-star dress uniform. Rows of ribbons, polished insignia, eyes that held both command and compassion. The portrait had hung in his study for 3 decades. Now it watched over the foundation that bore his name. I approached the frame and touched the wooden edge gently. I remembered him standing in my doorway the night I left for West Point, telling me that courage is not something you feel, it is something you do. I remembered him holding my first commission certificate, shaking my hand as though I were a fellow officer, not a child he had saved. I remembered his silence, not the heavy silence of abandonment, the steady silence of a man who spoke only when words mattered. And then I spoke aloud to the photo, not quietly, but with certainty. He didn't just save me. He taught me how to fight with honor. Megan placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice thick. "And now you're teaching others." Maybe, but I did not do this to prove anything. I did it to complete something. Children who grow up in military towns are taught resilience early, but not all resilience is chosen. Some of it is forced. Some of it comes from things no child should endure. The foundation was my way of lifting that weight from someone else's shoulders before it bent them the way it once bent me. Weeks turned into months. Our hotline received more calls. Our legal team intervened in more cases. We placed children into safe homes faster than any local program had before. We stopped 3 cases of parental abandonment before they escalated. We reunited siblings separated by long deployments. We helped a teenager from Fort Bliss regain custody of her little brother after a negligent guardian nearly caused him to drop out of school. Every file mattered. Every child mattered. And every time I walked past the framed gate photo, a grainy snapshot of Fort Hood's entrance in 1996, I felt the same quiet vow settle deeper into me. No child should ever stand alone in a place like that again. On the 1-year anniversary of the verdict, I returned to Fort Hood for the Foundation's first memorial ceremony. A small gathering assembled near the main gate: soldiers, families, Foundation volunteers, counselors, and a few children we had helped. A chaplain gave a short blessing. A sergeant placed an American flag beside a plaque we installed honoring unnamed military-connected children who had endured hardship without recognition. When it was my turn to speak, I did not prepare a script. I stood in front of them, the Texas wind tugging at my uniform, and let truth guide me. I told them that the measure of a community is not how it treats its strongest, but how it protects its smallest. I told them that every child deserves a first chance, a second chance, and sometimes a third. I told them that the military teaches us to leave no one behind, and families should live by the same creed. After the ceremony, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, approached me holding a small stuffed bear wearing a camouflage vest. She whispered, "Thank you for helping kids like me." I knelt to be eye level with her. "You're the brave one," I said. She smiled and ran back to her family. As the sun dipped behind the motor pool and shadows stretched across the asphalt, I looked again toward the gate that had once changed my life. Not with fear, with gratitude. If you believe kindness can save a life, comment, "Hope."